island news.
As I said earlier, I'm just going to do what the fuck I want on this show. I usually do anyway, or I usually get my way to talk about things that Reef may not want me to. But I was inspired to talk about this segment from my dad. My dad is a Pan-Africanist, very much wanting Black liberation throughout the whole African diaspora. My dad's originally from Barbados. And when I was at his work, just talking to him about another thing, he mentioned the Barbados Slave Code. And there was some information that I didn't even know in terms of how it has part of the reason of how slavery came to be, and we'll get into more details later, in this country was due to the practices that were basically initiated in Barbados, believe it or not. So what do you mean by that, Collin? So let's just get right into it. This is a little history lesson for a lot of you all that you may not even know if you lived in the States. So as you guys might know, Barbados is a small island in the east of the Caribbean, former British colony, and all of that. So this comes from HistoryPlex. Never heard of them before prior to pulling this segment together. But we're going to talk about the purpose and significance of the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. So notice that date.
Who are these
people?
Hey.
Oh.
Already with the big money's coming in. Appreciate it, staff. Appreciate you.
Thank you for the $5. Love that. Great way to come back. But let's get into the Barbados Slave Code, shall we? So according to HistoryPlex, slavery is not a passé subject. It is a form of human bondage that has its roots in ancient history. Chattel slavery was barbarous, and it originated with the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. This HistoryPlex post discusses the purpose and significance of this slave code. So, Emancipation Day is celebrated on the first day of August in Barbados to mark the abolition of slavery. It dates back to the slave uprising on the island called the Rebellion of 1816, which was led by a slave named Busa. And actually, if you look at the thumbnail, the guy that is in chains doing this is Busa, which you can find in Barbados. So I probably should do a segment on him at some point. But anyway, for a time. For the British monarchy, expanding the empire and establishing colonies all around the world was a prime objective, especially colonizing sugar plantation-rich areas that would certainly profit the British economy. Too many of the British settlers in the 1600s enslaving Africans was acceptable on the basis that they were non-Christians, as their numbers, meaning slaves, increased in Virginia and Maryland. Colonies there soon began a history of demarcation in the name of race, which developed into a set of laws for the Africans known as Slave Code. This code not only legalized slavery, but also allowed masters to carry out barbarous atrocities on the slaves. The origin of this code was Barbados, an island abundant in sugar plantations, and to reap benefits of these so-called plantation economies, the Barbados Slave Code in 1661 was established. Given below are its salient features. So we'll go into many of them. Go back.
I need it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In 1536, Portuguese explorer Pedro Campos halted in Barbados en route to Brazil and named the island Los Barbados, meaning the bearded lands. So most people think it may be, I forgot what kind of tree it is. That kind of looks like it had a beard. So that's one myth as to where the island got its name.
Gotcha.
Just a little about that. Even though the island was known to the Portuguese and Spanish, the British would claim it as their own in 1625, and thus began a history of slavery on the island. The first English settlement was set up as a proprietary colony and was financed by Sir William Corton, a London merchant who owned the claim to Barbados and several other islands. Thus, the first colonists were, in reality, tenants, and a substantial amount of their profits was reverted to Corton and his company. On May 14, 1625, the first English ship, captained by John Powell, along with his crew and 10 slaves, arrived and claimed the uninhabited land for England. On February 17, 1627, his brother, Captain Henry Powell, touched down with a party of 80 settlers and 10 African slaves. They established the first European settlement called Jamestown on the western coast, which is now known as Holetown. The slaves imported into Barbados came from various tribes like the Igbos, Papas, and Igbo, which is my ancestry, by the way, one of them, of the forests of West Africa. They arrived via slave trade ports on the African west coast. Such forts were known as the Axum and Elmina. After being swapped for trinkets, the slaves were shipped to the Caribbean and sold to plantation owners. In 1636, a law declared that all slaves brought into Barbados, whether African or Amerindian indigenous, were to be enslaved for life, which later extended to include their offspring. In 1642, the sugar revolution took over when the Dutch introduced sugarcane farming. By the mid-1600s, sugarcane plantations were developing and exporting sugar, appealing wealthy landlords with political associations. As the cost of white labor rose in England, more slaves were imported from West Africa, particularly the Gold Coast, and more Black slaves arrived in Barbados. The main groups of slaves imported were from the Ibibo, Yoruba, Libo, and Efik, as well as Asante, Fante, Ga, and Fang tribes. So basically, all those tribes were either mostly in what is now known as Nigeria or Ghana.
Yeah.
By the mid-1600s, there were estimated 5,700 Black African slaves in Barbados, and by the early 1800s, over 385,000. By the 1700s, Barbados was one of the leaders in the slave trade from the European colonies. African slaves were referred to as black gold, and they were the obvious choice as they were strong, and Africa lay close to Europe than the Caribbean. Slave ships traveled faster, aided by the trade winds blowing towards the west, and hence the slaves were chained and cramped into filthy ships to be sold into permanent slavery. As the import of slaves increased, the African population outnumbered the white population, causing paranoia and concern among the plantation owners against an onset of revolt. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
This led to each colony to pass a series of laws restraining the slave behavior, which became known as the Slave Code. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 was the first code to be passed in the Caribbean island among the English colonies. Subsequently, these codes were applied in the American English colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. And apparently, not just them, Massachusetts, and Georgia as well.
Yeah.
Basically, more or less, all the original 13 colonies in the States have some form or another of slave codes, which were inspired or partially inspired by
this one,
the Barbados Slave Code. So I thought this was kind of important because, one, I bet in U.S. history they didn't teach you any of this at all.
No, definitely not my.
A lot. Right.
Go ahead.
But number two, and I think this is kind of more important, this is kind of one of the reasons why when we learn history, we have to have a little more global scope, because we kind of think of slavery as
an American issue.
An American
it is not.
Invention. It is not. Now, slavery,
international,
you can argue, it's
trade fucking, like, the whole triangle, like multiple countries.
Right. And this is why I say to people in terms of, slavery, especially given American history, like and especially for people who are looking for reparations, you cannot just blame the American
Right.
system. You know, like this is why, and this is, I think, one of the things that, especially like certain groups, I'm not going to name them because I'm tired of naming them, you know, do not want you to know, or just are ignorant to that they're not going to make this connection. That a lot of why slavery happened, in especially in our case, was based upon the British and based upon the Caribbean. So it will work in your favor to kind of have a better understanding of the connection between Europe, Africa, and America in order to have a better scope as to essentially, as if you're a Black person living in the West, why essentially you were enslaved. Because
Right.
it's not just limited to, and again, I'm all for if you're looking for reparations as a Black person in this country, but you have to also understand that it's a lot bigger than what you think, just trying to limit yourself to the American standpoint. Because once again, given the dates, this was all in the 1600s. The US did not become their own independent nation until 100 years after this. So if you're going to have beef with America, you need to have beef with Western Europe as well, in terms of this. So, but also, and I'll get into this more a little bit later, but this is very reminiscent of currently, if you want to look at current events, of what's happening in Gaza as well. Because somewhat, in terms of, these are white settlers coming in, and using, and this is what's special about slavery in terms of the West, in terms of using it as profit. That's the difference between, oh, there were slaves. Yes, there were slaves. Like in the human experience, there's always been slaves, but slavery back, at least if you're thinking about the Roman Empire, whatever, was more connected to, I guess, to indentured servitude. This was the first time in history that slavery was used as a profit tool. And I read it earlier that, you know, white indentured servants who would have done the work as well,
Right.
were too expensive. So I wonder if people kind of caught that blacks, African slaves were considered black gold because essentially you didn't have to worry about them, you know,
Physically being able.
right.
Like,
But I think more importantly, like the idea of like, if you were indentured servitude, you were granted your freedom at some
freedom.
point.
Right.
You know, Black people were regarded as property. Like, I would argue even less than a dog, because I would argue at least dogs had a little more respect than Black
Yeah.
slaves. I probably would argue even that in the same way now in certain aspects. So, but yeah, I think this is kind of very important to have this kind of mindset of thinking more globally in terms of issues that are not insular to the States, which I think generally in our history books we tend to think as American and everyone else, when it's all connected. So let's get into more of this. Though these slave codes received legalized status and were supposed to protect the working rights of the slaves, but in contrast, they proved beneficial for the plantation owners and masters. Again, sound familiar?
Yep.
Like, does that sound like a law policy that we have that is meant to, quote unquote, protect the workers, but instead is really to protect the establishment more so?
Yeah.
So even back then, they were pulling this bullshit. Um, Under the provision of the law, the masters were to provide one set of clothing to the slaves every year, which consisted of a coarse material to be used as clothing. In reality, the masters lent out harsh punishments to slaves for minor mistakes, which included mutilation of body parts, burning the face or burning them alive, public flogging, sexual harassment, starvation, and forced conversions to Christianity. They were subject to chattel slavery. The word chattel is equivalent to cattle, which means that the master has total ownership of his slaves, and they were treated worse than animals at the hands of their masters. So, little vocab there. Slaves were not allowed to own any property, nor assemble or form groups without the presence of their master. Again, control.
Yep.
They were subjected to special curfews after working hours and prohibited from traveling in the fear they would run away. In court, slaves never received pardon, even if they were innocent, nor never allowed to witness or testify against a white man's crime. A similar impact was seen in the English American colonies. Virginia legalized slavery in 1661. In 1662, a law was passed ensuring that children born to Black mothers would also be regarded as slaves in spite of being fathered by white men. Now, who
Yep.
was that to protect?
Thomas Jefferson.
Maryland legalized. What's that?
Mainly. Thomas Jefferson, mainly. That motherfucker.
Exactly. Maryland legalized slavery in 1663 and passed a law punishing marriages between a white woman and slaves, saying that the woman who married a slave would serve her husband's master and their children would directly inherit the slave status.
Okay, so it goes both ways. Like, gotcha.
In 1664, slavery was legalized in New York and New Jersey. In 1667, Virginia enacted a law that ordained baptism was not a means to free themselves. A 1676 law prohibited free Black citizens from employing white servants. Virginia passed 2 consecutive acts in 1681 that mixed Native Americans and Africans into one class as Negroes and other slaves. A 1669 law adjudged that if a slave passed away while protesting his master, the master could not be accused of felony. An 1680 law imposed, a 1680 law imposed 20 lashes on any Negro or other slave who chose to carry a weapon or travel without their masters or mistresses' written permission. In some cases, the laws were quite specific, such as pig stealing was punished by nailing the thief's severed ears to a pillory post. There were directly given death penalty for lesser crimes such as ruining any stack of rice, corn, or other grain, or setting fire to any tar kiln, barrels of pitch, tar, turpentine, or rosin. Slaves were used both as variability for borrowing money and also as assets in the requital of debts. Creditors had first claim on slaves in settlements of debts. Slaves who had been freed could be re-enslaved if necessary to consolidate their late master's debts. These series of inhuman laws passed one after another in succession to the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 slowly gave way to revolts by the captured slaves in the Caribbean island. Slavery was abolished in Barbados in 1834, which was followed by a 4-year apprenticeship period through which free men carried on a 45-hour week without pay, in substitute for dwelling in tiny huts provided by the plantation owners. So, again, does that sound familiar?
Yep.
Doesn't that sound like capitalism? Well, Reconstruction, essentially.
Yep, that too.
So, what was happening in the States was happening on the islands as well.
Right.
So, and just as a fun fact, I'm trying to remember when my grandmother was born. I think she was born on my dad's side, I believe in 1890, I believe.
Okay.
So, and slavery was abolished, allegedly, in 1834. So my grandmother was born about 40 years, allegedly, after slavery. And I say allegedly because even like by the time she was born, there was still remnants of the slave code still happening even then, like at the turn of the century. So
like people forget that it's really not that long ago, you know? Like it's a couple generations, you know? Like
Right.
So
but a lot of the attitudes, especially around the slave code, existed during my grandmother's time. So, so really, yeah, it was abolished, but I think just the attitude and especially the treatment, of Black people on the islands hadn't gone away completely, especially given that, as we said back then, they were basically like sharecroppers, basically living on plantations by the time my grandmother
Right.
was born and living, so didn't go away completely. Freedom from slavery was finally realized in 1838. Well, as I was saying, maybe on paper, but not necessarily in practice. At the conclusion of the apprenticeship period, when over 70,000 Barbadians of African descent celebrated on the streets, singing and dancing to Barbados folk songs. So, again, just wanted to kind of bring that up in terms of, just how significant that the Barbados Slave Code was and how influential it was to developing the slave codes in the States. So, just to give you, some perspective on that. So I do actually want to kind of go into more specifics of, the slave code in South Carolina, given the ties between Barbados and South, because a lot of Bajan slaves ended up in South Carolina in particular, and then
right, the Gullah people, right? That
right,
whole area.
But then right, and then actually this is
Georgia
something
and
that my dad told me. I believe the first 6 governors of South Carolina were Bajan settlers.
okay,
So, so they were the ones that actually, knowing the slave code, implemented a lot of those practices directly, based on the work that was done in
right.
Barbados. So, but I did want to bring this up very quick. This is David Hartwood, famous actor. He is of Bajan descent. I think he lives in UK. And he, so this was taken from the Smithsonian Channel. So he went to Barbados to learn a little bit more about the slave code and its impact, given for him as a person of Bajan descent, but also, given, obviously his ancestry and his culture. So it's about 4 minutes. So if you want to play when you're ready, you can.
Can't help but think of all those ships arriving with millions of Africans, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, children, and just being chucked into some small holding and people grabbing your sister and brothers and selling them to complete strangers. If you think about all of that trauma, it plays a part in my own sense of the dislocation of my identity. Who am I? Where do I come from?
David now wants to find out how the enslaved were treated once they had been auctioned off to English settlers. He's come to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society.
Okay.
The museum documents how the British established a brutal model of slavery here that would soon be exported to other colonies.
Okay, so let's see if I can find them here for you.
It was known as the Slave Code, a system of laws and punishments which would become the model for slavery in America.
This volume makes it very clear that Africans were property, they were not individual human beings. And the question might occur, why were laws needed? Well, a very simple situation occurs where within 20 years of the establishment of a sugar economy in the island, the enslaved population outnumbered in a very significant way the white plantocracy. And they felt the need for a certain level of control.
Shortly after getting into the colony, you see change over time where the majority of the population are people of African descent. And so these English colonists are controlling their property. So they create these slave codes that dictate status, limits of freedom, what types of abuses can be imparted upon people of African descent if they attempt to run away or if they are seen as unruly.
If any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall for his or her first offense be severely whipped by the constable. For a second offense of that nature, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron.
And reading that slave code, that was British, that was English. It's an English invention that was franchised to several different countries. The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I'm a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse, nothing, because I'm not human. And I think that's fundamental to understand how that has affected and informed racism.
Yeah, so I think David kind of says it well. Like, this is kind of the basis of racism. And again, we think of it as a quote unquote an American construct. Well, it's a Western construct, but like,
Yeah.
I think when we think of race, especially given how toxic it is in America, we kind of think, oh, this is an American invention. No, it was British. Essentially given, like, you could see kind of like the roots of all of that starting from the slave code in terms of like pitting like even like white indentured servants with African slaves, even though they were doing the same work. At least if you were white and indentured servant, you had the opportunity to gain your freedom. And if anything, if you were a white indentured servant back then, once you gain your freedom, you were allowed to have slaves yourself. You were able to own property. You were able to have property. You were able to own slaves. Black people did not have that privilege. Again, you were treated, you were property to be sold off. And like, you know, like, again, this was happening in Barbados, and, you know, some slaves, if you were in Barbados, depending on the needs of in the colonies, you know, you could have been shipped from a Caribbean island and shipped to the States, or vice versa. If they needed you, if you were in the States and they needed you, like, depending on what crops they needed, in the Caribbean, you could have been sent from the States and sent back. So, like,
sugar,
like,
cotton,
you know,
tobacco.
Right. Like, you were essentially you were property in the name of capitalism. Black people.
Yeah.
So, you know, so, and, you know, so again, like, this shouldn't be taken lightly. And I think for a lot of people, they have a problem with that history because it seemingly makes us look weak in terms of how can Black people be almost allowed to be put in that situation to become property. I think it's a lot more romantic to kind of think about, oh, Black people were indigenous to America. And somehow, whether in that revisionist history, that we owned this land and we own culture. No, like, no, like, you know, I get the shame, but in order to kind of deal with it, and this is why I say to these people, like, if you owned this land, you did a shitty job of maintaining it because the white people essentially took over.
Right.
And you have nothing to show for it. So,
well, it's also the history's so far removed too, you know, like it's you know, it's ancient history for a lot of people who aren't paying attention to any of it. You know, they're going about their daily lives. So, you know, it's easy to kind of like rewrite and wash over it, you know. So,
but I think it's a lot easier if people do not understand the connections as
Yeah.
to certain things happen in certain ways due to other people, maybe not even from your country, influencing them. And, again, like, if people understood that these slave codes, again, that were British in scope, that were developed on a small island in the Caribbean, actually influenced, I would argue, the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
I think people would kind of think about the diaspora a little differently. Maybe. Like,
sure.
it's not just synonymous, it's not just isolated to one particular country or one particular region of the country. No, this is an enterprise. Like, in the same way what we're looking at Gaza, you might think that, oh, this is just a Palestinian thing. No, it's not.
Yeah,
This
it's
is a
international.
Western. It's
I mean,
international, bitch.
if you look
So-
at how we're going to get to this later tonight about how laws and governance in those places, especially against the subjugated, get pushed around the globe very quickly. So,
Right.
but speaking
especially
of
when it's
regions,
in terms,
go
right?
ahead.
Just really quickly, especially in terms of wanting to exploit people.
Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
It's very easy to get
Exploitation and control.
international backing, especially if there's money or resources or fill in the blank involved.
Yeah.
But that being said, let's go into this a little bit. So I kind of wanted to bring this as well. So this is from the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative, I believe that those are
Okay.
the acronyms.
Sure.
So I wanted to kind of show the significance of the slave code in South Carolina, especially as you said, the Golam people, have, essentially Bajan. They were Bajan slaves who were
And Haitian
exported to
and
South Carolina.
yeah.
So, and as I said, a lot of the practices that were developed in Barbados ended up in South Carolina in particular. So I wanted to kind of share that a little bit before we close the segment. But regardless, the development of a plantation economy and African slavery in Carolina began before English colonists and even settled Charlestown in 1870. In 1663, 8 Lord proprietors in England received land grants in North America from King Charles II for their loyalty to the monarchy during the English Civil War. The lords decided to combine their shares to establish a profit-seeking proprietary settlement, Carolina, between the English colony of Virginia and Spanish Florida. To ensure its financial success, they sent representatives to study the lucrative sugar plantation system on the Caribbean island of Barbados. They also recruited white settlers from this English West Indian colony to help launch their new North American settlement. These white Barbadians often brought enslaved African Caribbeans with them. So again, international enterprise.
Yeah.
Soon after, the original 8 Lord proprietors, one of whom, John Colton, was a Barbadian. Just a quick aside, I have a problem with calling him a Bajan.
Sure.
As a white settler.
Yeah.
Like
Barbadian.
But,
it's like
right.
Puerto Rican versus now I'm gonna forget the word. So close.
I guess.
Yeah. So but yeah.
But anyway, I digress. Obtained charters for Carolina in 1663 and 1665, a group of Barbadians led by John Yeamans attempted to establish a settlement on the Cape Fear River, now North Carolina. The settlement did not last, but Yeamans later became one of the first governors of Carolina from 1672 to 1674. Even before Charlestown, the first successful English Carolina settlement was founded in 1870, the Lords drafted a fundamental constitution of Carolina in 1669 that encouraged African slavery based on the West Indian model, Barbados.
Yeah.
This institution granted every freeman absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, which ensured West Indian planters they could continue using enslaved African labor when they immigrated to Carolina to establish plantations. The Lord proprietors also offered prospective Carolina settlers 20 acres of land during the first year of settlement for every black male they owned, and 10 acres for every black
Wait,
female.
what? Read that again. Proprietors also
The Lord
offered
proprietors
prospective
also
settlers.
offered prospective Carolina settlers 20 acres of land during the first year of settlement for every black male they owned, and 10 for every black female.
So you're a Barbadian, right? You have
White.
a certain
White.
amount of slaves, right? They offer you, hey, come to the Carolinas. We'll give you land per slave you own, because that's the ability you have to work the land, right? This is your
work the land and make us money. Yes.
Okay.
Again,
And fucking throwing a couple mules along with it, I guess. You know?
Right.
Like.
Right.
Sure.
Various white Barbadians who had been small to medium-sized landowners on the island emigrated to Carolina in the first decades of settlement. Of course they would, because more land, more profit. Many families who became prominent planters and slave owners in Charleston, including the Middleton, Brayton, and Gibbs families, had Barbadian origins. These Anglo-Barbadian settlers brought colonial experience, the parish system, the Anglican Church, and plantation slavery to Carolina. In the 17th century, Barbados and the West Indies were also Carolina's chief source of enslaved labor. 1/3 to 1/2 of Carolina's early enslaved laborers at this time migrated from the English West Indies, particularly Barbados, rather than directly from Africa. In exchange for enslaved Africans, sugar, and other commodities, Carolina settlers shipped lumber, pipe staves, pitch, tar, resin, beef, pork, corn, peas, and enslaved American Indians to Barbados and other West Indian colonies such as Jamaica. This trade connection launched Carolina's early economy before the growth of rice culture and continued until the Revolutionary War severed U.S. ties with other English colonies. These early trade connections were so significant that historian Peter Wolf described Carolina as a colony of a colony to Barbados.
Okay. And this is similar to, like, I know in Jamaica, large Indian population, right? Like, as in original Indian, not Native American Indian, where it's
Indigenous,
like, because British rule, you know, they're moving around their, you know, subjugated classes, you know.
But here you see how they're moving slaves around. So it's not like necessarily once a slave in one place, you stay in that place. No, you moved around where the need was. So, you know, so just like, again, global scope. In the name of capitalism, you're going to be moved, your equipment, basically. So where you needed is where they was going to send you, assuming that you would survive the trips between islands or the continental U.S. Anyway, many black and white settlers only briefly spent time in Barbados before arriving in Carolina. Still, their experiences on the West Indian colony influenced Carolina's commercial priorities and legal systems. In 1691, Carolina leaders established a slave code modeled almost verbatim after laws passed by the Barbadian Assembly between 1661 and 1688. Though such laws in practice were often flexible or ignored in early colonial contexts, this code served to legally define enslaved Africans as chattel property in Carolina. There are the most draconian statutes for enforcing slavery in the North American colonies. Through ongoing trading relationships with the West Indies, white and black Carolinas also shared information and ideas, including news about slave rebellions that occurred on various Caribbean islands throughout the 18th century. For whites in Carolina, this further encouraged fears about maintaining the safety of whites in a black majority colony and led to increasingly strict and violent enforced laws for Africans and African Americans in Carolinas and beyond. You know what this sound like that they didn't say directly? The police state.
Sure. Well, this is like the starts of this, right?
Yeah, this is the very roots of our current day police state. Again, out of fear, and again, it's out to, African slaves revolting or the prospect of them revolting that they had to protect themselves. So very certain, again, not explicit here, but you can make the connection. This is why the police state came to be. So, for enslaved Africans in Carolina, news of rebellions and Black resistance inspired hope for freedom, as well as concerns about white retaliation. So I'm going to stop there for now. But I think, again, slavery in the West, English invention, not American necessarily. And I think it's important for us to make that connection that, again, when it deals with capitalism, the West has its hands all over it, and it's not limited to just America. And again, you can make the connections with Gaza. It's a Western thing. It's not a strictly American thing. But again, you could see a lot of the roots of where racism, the police state, racial inequality, a lot of this stuff kind of stems from a little island, essentially, that, again, if you do not know your history, you would have thought that slavery was an American thing. And so I felt it was important to kind of share that, because, again, I don't think people will talk about it in this way, but I think more especially like in the independent media space, especially when we talk about slavery, is always within the context of it being an American construct when it really wasn't. It was, if anything, it was imported. So, but I think, again, this is another reason why we have to have a more global scope when we're looking at history and how these things connect to other places. Because we don't, then we, again, we become singular in terms of our thinking and not necessarily believe or can make the connection that just because it happened in one place or might not happen in one place doesn't mean it doesn't affect other places. And I think, especially in U.S. history, especially the way they teach it here in this country, it doesn't necessarily do a good job of that. Maybe with the West, possibly, but definitely not in other regions, especially in the global South, where I think there's a lot more of a bigger impact that it had on the global South than you would think. So I think kind of looking at history in that context, and I think a lot of that deals with the idea, again, this is all based on capitalism, which is the fuel that essentially runs the West. So if you are going to make that connection, you're going to have a lot of students who are going to kind of reject capitalism, which is not good to the thing, how things work here. So, so I think obviously that's kind of why, history is not talked about in this way. But I think that that's why we're here to kind of help you all make those connections. So shout out to my dad for the little history lesson that he gave me that I wanted to share with all y'all. So any thoughts before we close?
No, I think you nailed it. So capitalism causing all your issues.
I mean, at the end of the day, is
fucking class
at the end of the day,
and capitalism.
Yeah.
Fucking.
So.
Well.
So I will say this now. We're so we're gonna have, hopefully probably by next week, Dwayne Wong Omowale, who is a Pan-African writer and lawyer. So we're going to talk to him about the resistance that's happening in Togo. But I'm sure if I could figure out a way to kind of talk to him about some of this stuff in relation to this,
Sure.
I think he would be a good kind of person to speak to. So, but again, I think, yeah, this is just making more of the case of why we need to be looking at the global south a little more closely in terms of what's happening there, because what's happening in the global south, and especially now, like there's a lot of stuff we've reported that's happening in the global south that the West is ignoring on purpose, or people are ignorant to.
Yeah.
And that's by design, because God forbid that we in the West actually get some of those ideas, especially in terms of resistance. Can't have that here. So, but yeah, talking about issues and stories like these are why we're demonetized. So, if you want to help us out and support us financially, you can scan the QR code you see on your screen. You could type in the Ko-fi link you see at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're in the YouTube chat, you can type in !donate, all one word. That link will pop up, the Ko-fi link, and you can donate as anything, as much as $1 will help us immensely. You can also give on Substack, PayPal, and Cash App. Links are in the description below if you want to give via those apps as well. And as we say, we thank you guys so much for supporting us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our content, so maybe the algorithm might favor us a little bit. And make sure to leave a comment. Did you know that the Barbados slave trade was influential in creating, a lot of things, the isms that happened in the West, like racism, capital, like all those things that we kind of talk about, kind of stem from this little British colony, and was kind of exported out here. So let us know if you knew that or any thoughts about it. And help us get to free K. I think where we were at, I think
25.
we're over 2,500 now for sure.
Yeah.
So maybe, hopefully, I mean, I'm going to be very generous by the end of the year, but maybe even by fall, like October, can we hit free K? Perhaps, maybe.
Do it. Do it.
And thank you guys for watching.